If you were around during the Xbox 360 and PS3 era of gaming, then you definitely remember Dead Island. This was a really hyped up game, and when it came out, it was not only well received by players, but it also just felt like everyone was playing it. And that's because everyone kind of was. The game sold over 5 million copies in its first 6 months, which would be impressive for a game nowadays, but was even more rare back in 2011, a time before the gaming community was anywhere close to as large as it is today. But since then, people have grown less and less fond of Dead Island. Hell, if you just search Dead Island on YouTube right now, you'll get videos like Dead Island is one of the open world games ever, or Dead Island is a hot mess. So I went back and played the game in its entirety to see if it's as good as I remember it being, or if people are right and it was just never all that great to begin with. So Dead Island is an open world, first-person action role-playing game developed by Techland and published by Deep Silver, released back in 2011. Starting out, the game allows you to choose between 4 characters, each having their own unique strengths. There's Logan, who specializes in throwing weapons, Perna, the firearms expert, Shion, who is adept with bladed weapons, and Sam B, who demolishes zombies with blunt weapons. There's a good amount of variety between their skill trees as well, meaning that playing as a different character on a repeat playthrough will make the game feel meaningfully different, which is exactly what you can hope for from a game like this, but we'll come back to that. And for reference, for this video, I played through the game as Perna to get a good mix of melee and ranged combat for my footage. The game takes place on the fictional island of Banoi, which is a little ways off the coast of Papua New Guinea, and the basic setup for the story here is that there's a zombie outbreak on the island of Banoi, and the playable characters are simply trying to find a way to escape the island. It's also discovered very early on in the game that the 4 of them are all immune to the virus, which, in terms of the gameplay, just means that you get to be everyone's errand boy. And in terms of the story itself, it's pretty bad. The writing here is all over the place, the voice acting is almost never any good, and the janky and stiff animation in the cutscenes certainly doesn't help either. And there's some really touchy subject matter in this game that's handled with close to no care or respect, but I'm not even gonna get into all that shit in this video. I'm just saying that if you know what this scene is, then you know what I'm talking about. And there's a twist in this game that's pretty solid, but it doesn't even come into play until the game's standalone expansion, Dead Island Riptide. So while it is set up here, it's not really worth getting into, as it has no effect on this game's plot directly. But honestly, if you're playing Dead Island for the story, you kinda just bought the wrong game. One thing that definitely deserves credit in this game though is the setting. At the time, the zombie genre was incredibly focused on being set at night, in ruined cities, in underground labs, that sort of thing. But Dead Island came out of nowhere with a tropical island set almost entirely during the day, and it was really fresh at the time. In the last decade, a lot of zombie media has gotten a lot more creative in terms of its settings, but Dead Island came out at the peak of that late 2000s, early 2010s zombie craze that is now infamous for how lazy and repetitive it all became. And the graphics here aren't bad either. I've heard some people call Dead Island an ugly game, but honestly, if you look at this and you think it's ugly, I think we just have a different taste in game visuals. And I mean, sure, there are some individual parts of this game that look pretty ugly. I don't think the character models look very good. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the animation quality is pretty poor. But the environments, and especially like the lighting and the colors here, I'm a really big fan of the way that the majority of this game looks. And even though some parts of the game aren't very pleasant to look at, I think calling this game ugly is a massive exaggeration. There's a solid amount of variety with the settings here too, with the game starting in a luxury resort before moving to the slums of the nearby city, to the jungle, and even a max security prison near the end. But come on, let's get down to the real reason you came to Dead Island, and that's the zombie slaying. Like most modern zombie games, there are a variety of different zombie types that you'll end up coming up against. Early on, you'll really only deal with the slow-moving walkers, but by the end of the game, you'll have faster-moving infected, thugs that are essentially just giant tanks, the floaters that shoot acid at you, the rams that charge towards you and can only be damaged from behind, and more. And this was pretty par for the course by the time that this game came out, but it definitely still helps to add some variety to the combat here. And speaking of, the combat in Dead Island was really unique at the time for being a first-person melee combat game against The Walking Dead. I remember playing this game back when it first released and feeling like I was really getting up close and personal with the zombies, and feeling like the feedback from hitting a zombie with a blunt weapon or slicing a limb off with a bladed one just felt so much more visceral than in other games at the time. And it's weird because the melee combat here hasn't aged very well, because by today's standards, this feels super floaty and janky and unpolished. But back then, man, I'm telling you, like if you were there, this was fresh, this was new, this was impressive. And you'll notice that almost all of my melee gameplay in this video is being done with bladed weapons like machetes or katanas, and that's because my character has a skill that increases her damage with bladed weapons, again getting some of that character variety in there. But melee combat isn't all that Dead Island has to offer, as guns are a big part of the game as well. At least, they are near the end of the game. See, the game's campaign is split into 4 acts, and you won't even find your first guns until Act 2, and even when you get those, the ammo is incredibly rare, so you won't really start to find ammo regularly until Act 3, and even then, there's not going to be enough for you to like fully use guns and never use melee combat, and by the time that you're into Act 4, you'll actually be able to do that, but at that point, you're just finishing up the game. Where the guns really thrive is when fighting other human enemies like gangs of bandits or security guards. As these guys are still alive, a single headshot will put them down, so even just a flimsy little pistol will become the best weapon you have when fighting against them. But that also brings us to another problem with the guns in Dead Island, and that's the aiming. I played this game on mouse and keyboard for this playthrough, and it has to be some of the worst aiming I've felt in the game in a long time. To start, your sensitivity slows down considerably when aiming down the sights, so the inconsistency in your aiming speed will definitely lead you to over or under aim your shots way more than you would otherwise. And there's also a snap aim system in this game that's clearly made for controllers to help people out on thumbsticks, but it applies to the PC as well. It's kind of hard to describe to people who haven't played a shooter on mouse and keyboard before, but if you have, then you definitely know how awful it feels when the camera starts to move without you doing it with your arm. I really wish that guns had more of a place in Dead Island Sandbox, because having so many different variations of them and an entire character centered around using them just feels like a complete waste, considering they're never even your best option when used at their absolute maximum potential. And finally, to wrap up all the weapons talk, we have modifications. And this is what makes Dead Island Dead Island. Using blueprints and random scraps you find around the world, you can modify your weapons to have different effects and perks. And while you definitely won't remember the 1000th zombie head you stomped in, you will definitely remember that time that you set a police baton on fire and started swinging wildly with it. Dead Island has also been referred to as Fetch Quest the video game for as long as I can remember, and this is shockingly accurate. Roughly 95% of this game's quests, whether they're main quests or side quests, are a simple go here, get me this thing, and come back. And this is one of the largest flaws of the game. Since Dead Island is pretty much fully reliant on its gameplay, doing the same thing on loop for potentially up to 20 hours gets incredibly boring and repetitive. And it ends up being, in my opinion, Dead Island's most crippling flaw. I say that because that repetition can really start to stack on top of the repetition of killing the same like 6 zombie types with a handful of variations of melee weapons throughout the entirety of it. Overall, the big problem with playing Dead Island nowadays is that it just doesn't hold your attention all that well. There's nothing here that's going to absolutely blow you away in terms of like quality or creativity. And so you start to get that super repetitive gameplay and quest design thrown on top of it, and it really means that it's a game that you might enjoy for a few hours, but one that you probably won't play all the way through. But here's the thing. You don't play Dead Island because you're looking for some sort of high art in the storytelling, or because you want an experience with deep combat mechanics or systems, or because you're looking for the most unique quest design. You play it because you just want to turn your brain off and bash, chop, and shoot some zombies. Dead Island isn't perfect, but that's okay because the game is a damn fun time when it's doing what it wants to do. And it was exactly what gamers were looking for back in 2011. This was a time when all that players wanted was a fun game, and this one delivered. It definitely doesn't hold up to the level of analysis that we use nowadays, but if you're looking for a nostalgic trip back to the days of the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3, you can do a lot worse than Dead Island. So judging Dead Island as a zombie game that came out back in 2011 with the context of the industry at the time, I'm gonna give it a solid 8. I definitely wouldn't rate it that highly today. Obviously, with 12 plus years having passed now, our standards are a little different, but as someone who was there back when this came out, this was one of the most exciting games at the time, and while it hasn't aged so gracefully, it was perfect for what it was back then, and I have to give it credit for that. But what do you guys think? Have you played Dead Island? Do you have any thoughts on it? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a sub, just something to let me and the algorithm know that you enjoyed it. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. Also, let me know if you'd be interested in a separate video talking about Dead Island's standalone expansion, Dead Island Riptide, to talk about what went right and what went very wrong with that one. And if you want more videos like this one, then you might be interested in checking out my last video where we talked about the Far Cry game that everyone forgot about. If you want to check it out, I'll have it linked right here on screen.